let us do the normal business. Let's.
In October 1796, 2,000 black soldiers were locked inside a medieval castle on the Hampshire coast. They were prisoners of war, but they were free soldiers who had been fighting against slavery itself, recruited by revolutionary France after it abolished slavery in 1794. Britain at that point still owned slaves across the Caribbean. This is one of 14 black communities in Britain whose histories never made it onto the Heritage Trail, and it is the most forgotten entry on this list. Make sure you stay until number 1, because this is a story Britain has never fully reckoned with. Most people think Black British history started in 1948 with the Empire Windrush. It did not. Britain had settled black communities 300 years before that ship arrived, scattered across docklands, market towns, and medieval ports up and down the country. These 14 places do not appear on any official heritage trail. Most visitors drive straight through them without knowing what they are standing on. We are counting down all 14, starting here. Most people who know anything about British carnival culture assume the oldest one is Notting Hill. The Leeds West Indian Carnival, founded in 1967 by Arthur France MBE, holds the title of the oldest authentic Caribbean format street carnival in Europe. And most people who have been to both would not guess it. Chapeltown is Yorkshire's Caribbean heartland, established during the Windrush era, when families from Jamaica, Barbados and Trinidad settled in terraced housing in the inner north of Leeds. The community built something that has outlasted most of the physical neighbourhood around it. The carnival still runs every year, but the Chapeltown that Arthur France built it for has been hollowed out by decades of economic decline and redevelopment. The original terraces are largely gone. The community remains, but it sits inside a neighbourhood the planning decisions of the late 20th century did not treat kindly. Most people who go to the carnival do not know it was here before Notting Hill went outdoors, and that detail does not appear on any sign. If you ask most people when Britain's 1958 race riots happened, they'll say Notting Hill. They won't be wrong, but they'll be incomplete. The Nottingham race riots broke out in August 1958, a few days before the Notting Hill riots that same month. Clashes between white youths and Caribbean residents in the St Anne's area of Nottingham marked one of the first large-scale racial confrontations in post-war Britain. The Nottingham events are almost entirely absent from mainstream historical memory, buried under the weight of what followed in London. St Anne's grew as a Caribbean community during the Windrush era, drawn to Nottingham by the city's textile industry, which needed workers and had housing to offer. The original terraced streets of the district were cleared in one of the largest urban renewal programs of the 1970s. What replaced them was a social housing estate. The community rebuilt itself there. The riots that happened in those original streets remain one of the least told stories in post-war British history. Not because they were minor, but because London happened a week later and took all the attention. The story of Black Britain is not only a story of port cities and city neighbourhoods. In the late 1700s, historians estimate there were between 10,000 and 20,000 black people living across Britain. Peter Fryer's landmark history, Staying Power, uses 15,000 as a working figure. They were not concentrated in Docklands, but were spread across the whole country. Francis Barber was Samuel Johnson's heir and retired to Lichfield in Staffordshire. Olaudah Equiano, whose memoir became one of the most read books of the 1790s, spent years travelling rural England. Joseph Emedy, an enslaved African violinist, became the leading musician in Truro, Cornwall in the early 1800s. Parish records across Yorkshire, Devon and the Midlands record black baptisms, marriages and burials going back to the 1600s. These are real entries in real books that you can look at in county archives. The people they record have no plaques, no heritage markers, no local history walking tours. A rural black history covering more than a century exists in Britain's parish records. and almost none of it has ever been surfaced for a general audience. The records are there, the acknowledgement is not. Glasgow built its prosperity on two Atlantic trades. Tobacco came first. In the 18th century, the tobacco lords of Glasgow controlled most of the Virginia and Maryland leaf trade, and their wealth turned the city centre into something worth looking at. After tobacco came sugar, grown on Caribbean plantations and refined in Glasgow's warehouses. The Merchant City district, which visitors today walk through on the way to bars and restaurants, was funded by that plantation wealth. The streets still carry the names Buchanan Street, Glassford Street, Ingram Street, Jamaica Street. These are not coincidences. They are the names of 18th century slave traders, preserved in stone, while the communities their wealth displaced are not. Glasgow's black community is small by comparison with Liverpool or Cardiff, and frequently overlooked. What is less well known is that Glasgow was the site of the very first of the 1919 race riots. On 23rd January 1919, at the Mercantile Marine Office, white seamen tried to drive Sierra Leonean sailors out of the labour market. 30 Sierra Leonean seafarers were arrested. No white men were charged. In 2018, the University of Glasgow acknowledged it had received the equivalent of £200 million in slavery-derived donations and committed to a programme of reparative justice. The streets kept their names. Moss Side is usually described as a Windrush-era African-Caribbean community, which is accurate but incomplete. There was a black presence in Manchester's industrial districts before the Windrush, connected to the West African maritime supply chain that followed Manchester's cotton trade routes. That earlier layer from the early 20th century predates the 1948 narrative by decades, and it is almost entirely invisible in standard accounts of the area. The Manchester Caribbean Carnival, founded in 1972, is one of the oldest Caribbean street carnivals outside London. It came out of this community. Moss Side has been defined in public memory primarily by the violence and economic collapse of the 1980s and the 1990s. That framing has a cost. The community that built the carnival, that maintained civic institutions through the post-war decades, that brought the first West African maritime workers into the city a generation before Windrush, rarely gets mentioned in the same breath as the deprivation statistics. The community's history is longer than the crisis that got all the coverage. Steel Pulse formed in Handsworth in 1975 and went on to become one of the most internationally successful British reggae bands of the next 2 decades, winning a Grammy in 1985. Where they came from and what the neighbourhood looked like when they were writing their first songs rarely makes it into the story. Handsworth is the Midlands core Windrush settlement, and it carries 2 dates that sit heavily in its history. The first is 1981, when the Handsworth uprisings were part of the same national wave that hit Brixton and Moss Side, all of them rooted in the same combination of high unemployment, poor housing, and policing that used stop and search against young black men with very little restraint. The second is September 1985, when the Lozells Road riot burned through the commercial heart of the neighbourhood and became one of the most serious civil disturbances of that decade. The area that produced Steel Pulse and the Handsworth Cultural Festival also produced 2 of the most significant confrontations in modern British urban history. Those 2 facts belong in the same sentence, and they rarely are. The Notting Hill Carnival is the second largest street carnival in the world. After Rio de Janeiro, that part is well known. Far fewer people know how it started, and the real origin story involves a murder and a journalist who had already been deported from one country for her politics. On the 17th of May 1959, Kelso Cochrane, a 32-year-old Antiguan carpenter, was stabbed to death near his home in Notting Hill by a group of white men. No one was ever convicted. The killing came in the aftermath of the 1958 Notting Hill race riots, and it deepened a climate of fear across the Caribbean community in West London. Claudia Jones, a Trinidadian journalist who had been deported from the United States in 1955 for being a communist, organised an indoor Caribbean carnival at St Pancras Town Hall in January 1959 as a direct response to the riots. She said it was meant to wash the taste of the riots from the mouths of black people. The first outdoor Notting Hill Street Carnival followed in 1966, organised by a different community activist, Raune Laslet. Both women are now credited as founders. The carnival grew into what it is today, but the murder that made it necessary is not part of the story most attendees carry home. The Museum of London Docklands holds archives covering a Black and South Asian sailor population from the 18th century onward. Limehouse had a Chinese and Lascar community where Lascar was the term for South Asian sailors on British vessels. Canning Town was home to West African and Caribbean dockworkers from the late 19th century, and Stepney had Somali and Yemeni populations. The East End was also hit by the 1919 race riots. Research published in The Guardian in February 2025, drawing on Tower Hamlets archives, uncovered stories of black Londoners who had escaped slavery and integrated into free black communities in Stepney and Shadwell. Some churches in the area became known for baptizing formerly enslaved people, which provided a fragile layer of legal protection at a time when the status of black people on British soil was genuinely ambiguous. The story of the East End Docklands, as a centuries-deep Black and South Asian community, remains largely untold in mainstream British history. Those archives exist inside the Museum of London Docklands, and most visitors who walk through those galleries every year are not looking for this history. The galleries make it easy to miss. Brixton became the centre of Windrush-era settlement in London, partly for a reason that sounds mundane. Caribbean arrivals were temporarily housed in the Clapham South Deep Shelter, a converted Second World War underground facility, and many of them found private rooms in Brixton when they moved on. The neighbourhood they settled in was bomb-damaged and neglected, the kind of district where landlords were still willing to rent. Claudia Jones, the same Trinidadian journalist who organised the first Caribbean Carnival, edited the West Indian Gazette from Brixton. Founded in 1958, it was Britain's first black newspaper, and she ran it from above a barber's shop on the main street. The 1981 Brixton uprising was triggered by Operation Swamp 81, a policing initiative that used the SUS laws to conduct thousands of stop and searches across the area over a few days in April, with black residents bearing the weight of it disproportionately. The uprising lasted several nights and spread across a large stretch of South London, with widespread fires and damage to property throughout the area. Part of the same summer that hit Handsworth, Moss Side and Toxteth. The physical Brixton of that era, the terraces where Jones ran her newspaper, and the streets that erupted in 1981, has been almost entirely replaced by the regenerated version that exists today. The stories that follow go further back in time, and the erasure runs deeper. Number one is still ahead. South Shields has a claim that almost no one outside the northeast knows about. It became home to the first settled Muslim community in Britain. The first Arab seamen's boarding house in South Shields opened in 1909, and a Yemeni community took root in the streets around the docks over the following decades. At its peak, the Yemeni population in South Shields exceeded 3,000 people. An Arab quarter existed in a northeast English port town for most of the 20th century, and it barely appears in any mainstream account of British Islam or British immigration history. The 1919 race riots reached South Shields on the 4th of February 1919, when hundreds of people clashed at Mill Dam. 8 Arab men were sent to prison. No white men faced charges. The Glasgow riot had happened 2 weeks earlier, on the 23rd of January, and the wave swept through Liverpool, Cardiff, and the other major ports over the following months. In each city, the pattern in the courts was roughly the same. The physical traces of South Shield's Arab Quarter are largely gone, cleared during 20th century redevelopment. The men who built Britain's first Muslim neighbourhood, who opened the boarding houses and the cafes and the mosques, left almost no visible mark on the streetscape that replaced them. Caribbean Windrush arrivals settled in St Paul's and Euston in the late 1940s and 1950s, because these were the bomb-damaged inner-city districts where landlords would actually rent to them. The community built itself in the gaps that the rest of the city did not want. In April 1963, a group of Bristol residents decided to challenge the colour bar operated by the Bristol Omnibus Company, which refused to employ black or Asian bus drivers or conductors. The boycott was led by Paul Stevenson, Roy Hackett, Owen Henry, Audley Evans, Prince Brown, and Guy Bailey. It began on the 30th of April 1963 and lasted through the summer. On the 28th of August 1963, the same day that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the I Have a Dream speech in Washington, the Bristol Omnibus Company agreed to end the colour bar. That coincidence in dates was not planned. It happened because both campaigns had been building for months. The Bristol bus boycott led directly to the Race Relations Act, 1965, Britain's first anti-discrimination legislation. The Transport and General Workers Union, which had backed the colour bar and refused to support the boycott, issued a formal apology to the community in 2013. That was 50 years after the event, and the apology received almost no national coverage. St Paul's Carnival has been running since 1968. It remains one of Britain's oldest and largest Caribbean street carnivals. The bus boycott is not on the main tourist route through Bristol. Tiger Bay is the name most people know for the Cardiff Docklands, and by the mid-19th century, it had become what the BBC has described as one of Britain's first genuinely multicultural communities. Seafarers from Somalia, Yemen, the Caribbean, West Africa, China, and across the Arab world settled in the streets around Bute Street and the docks, drawn by Cardiff's position as the world's largest coal-exporting port at the height of its industrial power. More than 50 nationalities eventually settled there. The community produced Betty Campbell. Born in Butetown in 1934, she was told by a teacher as a child that a working-class black girl couldn't become a teacher herself. In 1973, she became the head teacher of Mount Stewart Primary School in Butetown, which made her the first black head teacher in Wales. She spent the next decades teaching black history in Welsh schools at a time when the national curriculum contained almost none of it. Nelson Mandela sought her out on his visit to Wales. She had written to him for years, and when he came, he wanted to meet her. In 2021, a 4-metre statue of Betty Campbell was unveiled in central Cardiff. It was the first statue of a named woman in any outdoor public space in Wales. The community that shaped her, the one built in the Docklands over 150 years, is almost entirely gone. The Cardiff Bay Regeneration Project cleared the original housing and replaced it with waterfront apartments and the Wales Millennium Centre. The community is still there, displaced into surrounding streets, but the waterfront their ancestors built the coal trade on is now a tourist destination, and the history beneath it requires effort to find. Britain's oldest continuous black community is in Liverpool, and some families there can trace their black ancestry in the city back 10 generations. The origins go back to at least the 1730s. Early settlers included freed enslaved people, domestic servants, and the sons of African rulers who were sent to Britain for education. The parishes of St James, St Thomas, and St Peter's mark the area where the community first put down roots. By 1795, Liverpool controlled roughly 5/8 of the entire European slave trade. The ships that drove that economy created the community. Free black sailors, former servicemen, students, and workers who arrived through the same maritime infrastructure that moved enslaved people across the Atlantic. After the 1772 Somerset case, those who arrived in Britain were legally free, which meant the community that formed in Liverpool was distinct from the enslaved people transported on those same ships. Both histories belong to the same city. The parish church of St. James holds both of them inside its walls. It has monuments to slave trading families. It also has baptismal records for black residents from the late 18th century, some of the oldest surviving evidence of continuous black settlement in Britain. The 1981 Toxteth riots lasted several days and left over 250 police officers hospitalized, around 160 people arrested, and roughly 150 buildings burned. The same forces that drove Brixton and Handsworth also drove Toxteth. The same neglected housing stock, the same collapsed local economy and policing that treated black residents as suspects by default. Today you can sit down in a Liverpool library with a free computer and access census records going back to 1841, find my past digitised parish archives, and street directories that track families through generations in the same few streets. A 10-generation black British family history is there in those databases, for anyone who looks. Portchester Castle sits on the edge of Portsmouth Harbour, a Norman fort built within the walls of a Roman shore fort from the 3rd century. In October 1796, roughly 2,500 people were brought inside its walls, approximately 2,080 black and mixed race soldiers, along with 333 European soldiers and 99 women and children. They came as prisoners of war, and the British state had very little idea what to do with them. These were not enslaved men. They had been serving in the French Revolutionary Army, which had abolished slavery across its territories 2 years earlier, in 1794. France had recruited freed Caribbean people into integrated military units, and these men had fought in those units against Britain and against the return of slavery. They were captured at the surrender of Fort Charlotte on the island of St. Lucia on the 26th of May 1796, and from St. Vincent, and transported to Britain. Britain at that time still owned hundreds of thousands of enslaved people across the Caribbean. These men arrived in a country whose economy depended on the continuation of the institution they had been fighting against. The British state had no existing category for what they were. They were prisoners of war who were also free men who had also been fighting against British imperial interests. English Heritage curator Abigail Coppins has identified over 2,000 of these prisoners by name from surviving records. Those names appear in almost no popular British history. 2 of the men held at Portchester, Magloire Pelage and Louis Delgrès, were released and returned to the Caribbean. In 1802, Napoleon reinstated slavery across the French Caribbean colonies. Both men organized armed resistance in Guadeloupe against the reimposition of slavery. Delgrès refused to surrender. He gathered his remaining forces and retreated to Fort Matuba. On the 28th of May, 1802, as the French troops closed in, he detonated the powder magazine. He died along with several hundred of his followers, rather than allow them to be re-enslaved. He had been a prisoner in a British medieval castle 6 years earlier. He died choosing death over chains. Portchester Castle today is a scheduled monument managed by English Heritage. It receives tens of thousands of visitors every year, and it has a guidebook. The guidebook does not mention the 2,080 black soldiers who lived inside its walls for 2 years in the 1790s. The names that Abigail Coppins identified are in the archives. The story is not on the interpretive panels. Britain's black history is not a 1948 story. It is a 300-year story, and the communities that built it were overlooked, cleared, and misrepresented for most of that time. That history is still there if you know where to look. the parish registers, the dock archives, the local history collections that do not advertise themselves. Most of the buildings are gone. The records are not. Subscribe and stick around. There are more stories like this coming.
It tastes like white bread, but it also has whole grain. How does it taste like?